now start our recording. So this is class 8, which I've called the 7 plagues, which I'm hoping to be able to get through all 7 today. And it would be nice in human history if we were to be able to move that quickly through all the plagues. So we're going to start with the plagues.
Can't hear you, David.
I'm sorry? What's that? Are you okay? All right. So we're going to start with the plagues and begin on chapter 14. So I am going to mute everybody, and then we're going to do a screen share so you can see what it is that we are looking at. There we go. Okay. So chapter 14. This is what I meant to get through last week. So I'm going to go through it rather quickly. So then I looked, and there was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion. Lamb is the one who is Jesus, standing on Mount Zion. Mount Zion is the famous place where the 10 Commandments were handed out. With him were 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. If you remember, we have 12,000 from each tribe. And again, this is just showing completeness or a large number. And that everyone who follows Jesus gets the seal or the mark of God. And so they have this mark or this seal. I heard a sound from heaven like there was a sound of rushing water and loud thunder. Pay attention to the sound because this Sunday is Pentecost Sunday. And so listen for what Peter and the rest of the people say they heard when the Spirit came down upon them. So the sound I heard was that like of a harpist playing their harps. They sing a new song in front of the throne, the 4 living creatures and the elders. And no one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been purchased from the earth and been purchased. This is the theological belief that Jesus, with his death, has purchased us, that we have been bought by him. And so, verse 4, they weren't defiled with, where were we? With women, for those people who follow the Lamb are virgins. And so I had more notes on this, but I think I'm going to jump past this. In the Old Testament, there are many references where those who they're not associated with women are associated for fighting a war. And so that's this part. And there are many different definitions of this particular word. And so that's a whole separate class. So we'll just run with this. They were purchased from among humankind as early produce for God and the Lamb. No lie came from the mouths, and they are blameless. And then I saw another angel flying high overhead with eternal good news to proclaim those who live on earth and to every nation, tribe, language, and people. So he said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come." So what I almost entitled this whole session was "The Hour of His Judgment Has Come." And maybe I should have, but this is the sense that God, who is the judge of everything, has now finally decided to judge. And then the command of worship the one who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of water. Another angel, a second one, followed and said, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has made all the nations drink the wine of her lustful passion." Do not think of this as it is exactly written. Think of it as in poetic language. The lustful passion of Babylon. So Babylon, Rome is the new Babylon. We can make that direct parallel. That this highly symbolic language is writing of a time back with the Israelites when Babylon invaded. And in the present sense of the first century, the new Babylon is Rome. Rome had a problem. And the problem is that it had a large number of people, and they were not producing food or any other item like that. And so they had to continually head out into the empire for fish and for grain and for wine, for oil. And that affected particularly the people in Palestine, which is modern-day Israel, and also the diaspora, so Western Turkey and that Mediterranean area. So when Peter and his other friends that were fishermen, they were fishing at an unprecedented rate because Rome was hungry and Rome needed more and more fish. And there is very strong evidence to show that the Sea of Galilee had been overfished and that they were running out of fish. Likewise, the oil that was produced, the olive oil that's produced in that region, that the demands were getting stronger and stronger. Likewise, the taxes continued to increase because Rome needed a greater and greater amount of cash flow in, besides all of the necessary ingredients. Again, fish, grain, wine, olive oil, all that stuff. So in Peter's day, and then of course in John's day throughout the 1st and 2nd century, there were people of the Jewish faith who had farms that were multi-generational farms. And because of tax levels and a variety of other things, they could no longer afford their farm. And they were having to leave their farm and travel into the cities to find work. And so for every Jewish family that lost a farm and they had to head into the city to find work, it was further wondering of where is God's justice and why are we suffering this way? So the wine of Babylon's lustful passion should, the way that I read it, you can read it however you want. I read this as economic. I read that the lustful passion is that the growing city demands more and more resources, both in taxes and in real commerce. And so she was sending that out, and her Roman guard would go out and force people to work harder and longer in order to provide for the city of Rome. So we are going to hear a lot more about this lustful passion next week. So I wanted to first throw this in there, that Rome will be referred to as a prostitute, and it's going to be rather harsh language. And so it's going to be a PG-13 class next week, but we are going to talk very specifically in economic terms and what that means. So, so the second angel is the one is saying that that essentially Rome has fallen, and she's made all the nations drink of her wine, her lustful passion. And so when she falls, they all fall. Then another angel, a third one, followed them and said in a loud voice, "If any worship the beast and its image and receive the mark on their foreheads or their hands, they themselves will also drink of the wine of God's passionate anger, poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. They will suffer the pain of fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and the Lamb. The smoke of their painful suffering goes up forever and always. There is no rest or night for those who worship the beast and its image and those who receive the mark of its name." If anybody wants clear and concise language, here it is. So they will suffer. So you have two different groups, those that are marked as God's own forever, and those that are marked that worship the beast. And those that had been marked as God's own forever have been suffering. And now, in a sense of homeostasis, that's going to change. And those that have the mark of the beast will also receive what's due to them. And so they themselves will also drink of the wine of God's passionate anger. So let me check the time. Okay, I'll do this hopefully quickly. So with Holy Communion, Jesus lifted up a cup and he said, "This is my blood shed for you for the," if you know the words, say them with me. "This is my cup shed for you for the forgiveness of sins." Okay, so the cup that he drank was the cup to forgive the sins of all. And he said, this cup, this is my blood, this is my life force that is poured out for you, again, for the forgiveness of sins for you and for many. So the cup of wrath, if you read in the Gospels, when Jesus is running through this, you will notice that he says, "I will not drink again of the cup." I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine. The other cup that would be on a Passover table is for this cup, which is God's justice. And so it appears as if this cup of his wrath is now coming into fulfillment. And those that drink of the cup for the forgiveness of sins will receive forgiveness. Those who do not are receiving the cup of his wrath. So that's the black and white nature of what we're looking at. So, okay, so verse 12. This calls for the endurance, and we've talked about endurance already, the endurance of the saints who keep God's commandments and keep faith with Jesus. So endurance, if I can switch up here, what is the meaning of suffering? And that is that endurance. So we are to endure suffering now because God will have justice and God will punish those who need to be punished. Okay. Verse 13, and I heard a voice from heaven say, write this, favor to the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, so they can rest from their labors because their deeds follow them. If any of you have been to an Episcopal memorial or funeral service, you will recognize these words. That this is part of the liturgy that we use to begin the service. So blessed are they who die in the Lord because they rest from their labors. So if any of you are like, where have I heard that? That's where it is. Page 460, maybe, I'm remembering off the top of my head. In a Book of Common Prayer, you'll see it somewhere in there for burial. So verse 14, then I looked and there was a white cloud. On the cloud was seated someone who looked like the human one. The human one is the Lamb, the Christ, Jesus himself. He had a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. A sickle is a symbol of judgment, that who holds the sickle is the one who judges. And the judgment comes at the end of the season or at the harvest. And when Jesus talks about bearing good fruit and those that bear good fruit, those that bear bad fruit, all of the imagery in the Old Testament, there are way too many things for me to quote, about God has planted a vineyard and the vineyard produced good grapes, but people came in and stole them, or God planted a vineyard, but the grapes were sour, and then the vineyard owner destroyed the grapes. All of this image has to do around with the sickle and with the harvest time. And so when you hear the time of judgment is here, this is now the time of judgment. And the one with the sickle or the harvest time is here. And another angel came out of the temple, calling in a loud voice. Another angel came out of the temple, calling in a loud voice to the one seated on the cloud. So the one seated on the cloud is the human one. Use your sickle to reap the harvest, for the time to harvest has come, and the harvest of the earth is ripe, which means now is the time that God's judgment is going to be laid out here. So the one seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. If you ever have an image of Jesus returning to the earth and he's riding a cloud, now you know where that comes from. So let's go to verse 17. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven. And for those of you that like numbers, feel free to count how many angels have come out. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who has power over fire came out from the altar. He said in a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, use your sharp sickle to cut the clusters in the vineyard of the earth, because the grapes are, sorry, I was looking at something else, because the grapes are ripe. So the angel swung his sickle into the earth and cut the vineyard of the earth, and he put what he reaped into the great winepress of God's passionate anger. Then the winepress was trampled outside the city, and the blood came out of the winepress as high as horses' bridles, or almost 200 miles. So hold on to that image, because I am going to show you the first of many of our biblical references. So this is from Isaiah 63. Isaiah is one of the Old Testament prophets who refers to God's kingdom as a vineyard. We'll sometimes refer to Israel as a vineyard. We'll refer to God's people as grapes. And if you remember when Jesus said, I am the vine, you are the branches, this is all about grapes and vineyards. So Isaiah 63, who is this coming from Edom, from Bezrah in bright red garments, the splendidly dressed one striding with great power? So remember how we have the human one? That looks like the human one. It is I proclaiming righteousness, powerful to save, says that one. Why is your clothing red and your garments like those of who stomps on grapes? I have pressed out the vat by myself. From the peoples, no one was with me. I stomped on them in my anger, trampled them in my wrath. Their blood splashed on my garments and stained all my clothing, because I intended a day of vengeance. The year of my deliverance had arrived. I looked and found no helper. I was astonished to find no supporter, but my arm brought victory for me. My wrath helped me. I trampled down nations in my anger and made them drunk on my wrath. I spilled their blood on the ground. Um, this is a well-known phrase talking about what God is going to do to Babylon that was holding the exiles, the people from Israel, and using the imagery of how wine is made. And if I can go on to a lighter note, for those that watched the TV show I Love Lucy, and remember how Lucy got into a vat and started to smash the grapes, and then the person that was with her, they got into a bit of a wrestling match. Remember that very famous? Okay, good. So at least I can get a smile out of some of you today. That is how wine was made back then. And the grapes did nothing wrong. This is just what the grapes do, that they just need to be smashed. And then the more advanced models would have a large circular wheel that goes down, and then it would have a device that screws down on top and starts to press. And what comes out is the juice from the grapes themselves. And that's what goes into barrels, that's what is then aged, and that is what is then drunk. And so using that image of, now it was black and white, but if you remember, Lucy was covered in grapes. And so if you look or consider the one who was doing this following Isaiah 63, that that image is used for God's judgment. So if we go from there and go back into our reading for today, let's see, he put what he reaped into the great winepress of God's passion and anger. Then the winepress was trampled outside the city. By the way, Jesus was crucified outside the city, and the Gospels go to great length to remind us of that. So then the blood came out of the winepress as high as horses' bridles for almost 200 miles. If you remember, Jesus was killed outside of the city, and he was struck with a spear, and water and blood came out. For every action, equal and opposite reaction, that this is now God's reaction to those who have disobeyed or gone against God's will and has gone against the saints of the church. So, like it or not, that's what it says. And then 200 miles, if I can just have a little bit of fun with that, for those that like numbers. So it is technically, obviously the author didn't know miles. They knew stadia, and that's Stadia. It's a measure like a mile for us. And so 1600 is what the Greek writes. And so in how do you get to 1600? 1600 is 40 times 40. So if you'd like to count the number of 40s in the Bible, go for it, and be sure to read Psalm 40. Israelites were in captivity for 40 years. If you think about Noah, how long he was waiting, if you just take those numbers 40. So the 40 in numerology, so the idea of what the number means, 40 means to change from one thing to another, a graduation. So when somebody graduates, that's the number 40, that they're moving from one thing to another. The Israelites, it took 40 years to move from being slaves to being free. Jesus was in the desert for how long? 40 days to move from this to that. When he came out of the desert, he said, repent, the kingdom of God is near. That it's always an idea of moving from one thing to another. 1600 being 40 times 40, that means that the horse's bridle, that the wine press and the wine or the blood that came out ran for 40 times 40, moving from this thing to another thing. So even though it's a short phrase, it is to symbolize that we have moved from one thing to another. Like to see what the other thing is, keep reading. So chapter 15, then I saw another great and awe-inspiring sign in heaven. Here we have the next series of visions. So many people refer to the book of Revelation as Revelations, and they put an S on it, even though there's no S. It's called Revelation. And so it's just one of those picky things with me. When people say, I read Revelations, no, technically it's Revelation. But in their defense, for everybody who says Revelations, it's because we have so many different visions. It is as if we are having many revelations. The reason why it is Revelation is that it's one whole book, one whole complete image, and that the curtain has been pulled away. And it is one whole vision that we have. So John says, I then saw another great and awe-inspiring sign in heaven. There were 7 angels with 7 plagues. If you remember the number 7, 7 means complete. So 6 incomplete, 7 is complete. 7 is holy, 6 is of the earth. And so last week we talked about the number 6 being tripled, and that is all things of the earth, and God being all things complete of heaven. So 7 plagues, 7 angels, a complete number. And these are the last, for with them God's anger is brought to an end. So this is a completing of everything. When you read God's anger, that is, I mean, it's the best translation from Greek to English, but it should be, in our day and time, this should be viewed as, instead of God being angry, that this is God's response to human sin. And God's response to human sin is this. So God's anger is God's response. And the God that I believe in has complete control over his emotions. And so he doesn't get angry like you and I do. When we lose our mind, we get angry. That this is something different, that God is going to be doing it differently. And so whenever you see God's anger, just what I do is I think that this is God's response to human sin. So here it is, the end. So the next thing he sees is what I saw happened to be a sea of glass mixed with fire. Fire is an image of God's judgment. So we had a sickle, and then we had a fire. And so those who gained victory over the beast, its image, and the number of its name, were standing by the glass sea holding harps from God. And if you ever see images of people in heaven and they're playing harps, ever wondered where in the world did that come from? Here it is. So who has gained victory over the beast, its image, and the number of its name? Who has gained victory are those that have the mark or the seal of God. Those who have been baptized, those who are wearing the white robes, those who follow and believe in the Lord. That is victory. It is a different sense of victory as you would have as a military victory in the first century. That the victory they have is that they have been persecuted and they have been killed for their testimony or their belief. That is gaining victory. The ones who have endured, the ones who have suffered, are the ones who have gained victory. So that's this. They are standing by the sea holding harps from God. They sing the song of Moses, of God's servant. And we'll read this, but great and awe-inspiring works are yours, Lord God Almighty, just and true are your ways, King of nations. Why, who won't fear you, Lord, and glorify your name? You alone are holy. All nations will come and fall down before you and worship, for your acts of justice have been revealed. So there is a direct parallel with Exodus chapter 15 of when the Israelites were standing on the other side of the sea, and that God has sent the waters and has taken out the Egyptian army, that they begin to sing. And then verse 20 is there's a prophet. Her name is Miriam, and she is the sister of Aaron, and Aaron is the one who helped Moses. And she grabbed a tambourine and had all the women join with her in singing. And so this song is a completion of the song that Miriam and all others started to sing when they saw the water rush over and take out the horse and rider. So that's what that part is. If you can tell, I'm skipping. I'm trying to stay ahead of our time. So if you'd like to read more about that, it's Exodus chapter 15. So verse 5. After this, I looked, and the temple in heaven, that is the tent of witnesses, was opened. So the tent of witnesses, remember witness, martyreto in Greek, that's where we get the word for martyr. So those that have testified, those are the believers. The tent of witnesses was opened, and the 7 angels who have the 7 plagues came out of the temple. They were clothed in pure bright linen, and had gold sashes around their waists. This appears to be people who are participating in the worship in God's temple. So then one of the 4 living creatures gave the 7 angels gold bowls full of the anger of God who lives forever and always. So remember that anger, this is God's response to human sin. They're full of that. And then verse 8, the temple was filled with smoke from God's glory and power, and no one could go into the temple until the 7 plagues of the last 7 angels were brought to an end. This is very reminiscent of when Moses had the Ark of the Covenant. So when he had the 10 Commandments, and there was a tent that held them, that God's power and might and glory would come out of the temple with smoke and God's radiating power. And Moses would not enter the temple while the smoke was happening. In fact, no one could go in. And so then once that would subside, then Moses would go in to talk to God. So this is what is on earth is also in heaven. And so the same thing that Moses experienced is being experienced in heaven. All right. That is chapter 15. Isn't that nice? Nice little short chapter. So now we're going to go to 16, which will be the bulk of our time left here. So then I heard a loud voice from the temple say to the 7 angels. So the temple had to be evacuated because God's glory is happening. So the voice must be from God himself. Go and pour out the 7 bowls of God's wrath, God's anger on the earth. So before we read the rest of this, I'm going to do a large amount of biblical work. So for those that may not be familiar with the plagues that Moses had happen to Pharaoh in order to set his people free. So Moses is with the people, they were called the Hebrews, and they were enslaved in Egypt. And Pharaoh was the most powerful, the largest, most powerful empire and army ever assembled. And God said, go set my people free. So these are the plagues that happened to the Pharaoh and to the people so that he would let the Hebrews go. So in case you weren't familiar with them, I'm going to run through them all together because you will hear them all in chapter 16. So the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take handfuls of ashes from a furnace, have Moses throw it up in the air in front of the Pharaoh. The ashes will turn to soot over the whole land of Egypt. It will cause skin sores that will break out in blisters on people and animals in the whole land of Egypt. So they did it. And it caused the skin sores and blisters to break out. But they all end with, the Lord made Pharaoh stubborn, and the Pharaoh wouldn't listen to them, just as the Lord had said to Moses. So that's one plague. The next plague, he raised the shepherd's rod, hit the water on the front of the Nile, and all the Nile turned to blood. And then stretch out your hand, the shepherd's rod over the rivers, canals, and the marshes, and make the frogs crawl up over the land of Egypt. So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs crawled and covered the land. Then the Lord said, Moses, raise your hand toward the sky, so the darkness spreads over the land of Egypt, a darkness that you can feel. So some would say this is depression. Moses raised his hand toward the sky, and an intense darkness fell on the whole land of Egypt for 3 days. And then Moses raised his shepherd's rod towards the sky, and the Lord sent thunder and hail. Lightning struck the earth, and the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. And the hail and the lightning flashed in the middle of the hail, so they were severe that nothing had been like it in the entire land of Egypt since it first became a nation. So those are the plagues. And here is Revelation. If you're looking closely, that did not go in order as it was written, but I put it in order for how it plays out here in Revelation. So the first angel poured out his bowl on the earth, and a nasty and terrible sore appeared on the people who had the beast's mark and worshipped its image. The second angel poured his bowl into the sea, and the sea turned to blood, like the blood of a corpse, and everything living in the sea died. The third angel poured his bowl into the rivers and springs of water, and they turned to blood. That sound familiar? So there we have it. At the probably our last class together, when I put all things in motion together, I'm going to talk about economic and ecological damage. So we're going to compare economics and ecology, because one way to read this is terrible sores, and then everything turned to blood, and all living things in the sea died, and then the rivers and springs, they also turned to blood, so unusable. So there is great ecological damage here. So then I heard the angel of the waters say, "You are just, Holy One, who is and was, because you have given these judgments. They poured out the blood of the saints and the prophets, and you have given them blood to drink. They deserve it." Again, on one hand, you did this to the people that are of God, and now you get to live with this because of your actions. So blood and blood. Then I heard the altar say, remember the altar had the people that had given their testimony or their witness and they had died. This is the altar that had cried out before, "How long? How long do we have to wait for your justice?" And so then the altar says, "Yes, Lord God Almighty, your judgments are true and just." So they are now, if I can do something real quick, those that had wondered, why are the wicked not being punished? And when they cried out, "How long, O Lord?" Well, now, here they are. They said, "Your judgments are true and just." So the victory that they had been asking for, they are getting. The fourth angel poured his bowl on the sun, and it was allowed to burn people with fire. By the way, when we had that hole in the ozone, this was quoted a lot, that the fourth angel has done it, when in fact, we did it ourselves. But the people were burned by intense heat, and they cursed the name of God who had power over the plagues, but they didn't change their hearts and minds, lives, and give him glory. The fifth angel poured his bowl over the beast's throne. The beast's throne, if you remember, the beast is Rome, and so the throne would be that of the emperor. Poured his bowl over the beast's throne, and darkness covered the kingdom. People bit their tongues because of their pain, and they cursed the God of heaven because of their pains and sores, but they didn't turn away from what they had done. Then the sixth angel poured his bowl on the great river Euphrates. So if you remember how we have an angel that turned the sea to red, and then we have a different angel, we have a different plague that turned all the fresh water. So here we have that. It was dried up, so was ready for the kings from the east. Then I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs come from the dragon's mouth, the beast's mouth, and the mouth of the false prophet. All right. I'm going to highlight that for now. So 3 unclean spirits. So the dragon, that is Satan himself. That is the one who was thrown down from heaven. That is the one who has power over evil angels. So that's the dragon. The beast of the sea. When you hear about the beast of the sea, this is the Roman Empire. And then when you hear about the beast of the land are those who corroborate or work with the empire. Those are the ones who are the ones who have done the persecuting to God's people. So we have those three things. We have the dragon, or the devil himself. We then have the empire, and then those who pull out the empire's work. And so when we have these things, the three unclean spirits that came from the dragon's mouth, the beast's mouth, and the mouth of the false prophet. This is out of Satan himself, out of the mouth of the empire, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. The false prophet is a very interesting one. There seems to be no difference between the false prophet himself and those who follow the false prophet, that they all seem to be wrapped in together. So John says these are demonic spirits that do signs. They go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them for battle on the great day of God Almighty. So again, no distinction between the false prophet and the kings of the world who gather people for battle on the great day. They are all wrapped in together. And then verse 15, in my particular translation, has these, it kind of holds it off by itself, because this phrase, verse 15, is just dropped in from nowhere. And it's a quote from Jesus. Look, I'm coming like a thief. Favored are those who stay awake and clothed so they don't go around naked and exposed to shame. So Jesus had said this in many different places in different gospels about the thief in the night. Be aware, be on guard. Favored are those who stay awake. This is from the 5 foolish bridesmaids and the 5 wise bridesmaids, the ones who kept their lamps lit, the ones who stay awake. This is, Jesus has said this so many times, it's hard for me to put all of the quotes into place. And so verse 15, in my opinion, is translated directly from what Jesus had said, and that John was reminding everybody, stay awake. So the spirits gathered them at the place that is called in Hebrew Armageddon. And I hope that this is not the first time that you all have heard the phrase Armageddon or Armageddon, as it most popularly is mentioned. So let's spend just a little bit to hash this thing out, because it appears as if all of those that support the emperor and the empire are the ones that are supporting the dragon or Satan himself, and they are gathering together to fight against the forces of God, and that they do that in one place that's called Armageddon. So if you want to do a quick Bible search, there is only one mention of Armageddon in the entire Bible, and you are looking at it right now. For as much as others have said it is riddled throughout the Bible, it is not. This is the only place you can find it. However, you have to get into what that word means. And so I'm going to get into the meaning to show you that there is more things going on here. So this is from this is from the Photo Guide Sampler of the Accordance Biblical Software. So this is really straightforward, orthodox, kind of boring stuff. And you might say, but that doesn't say Armageddon. That's right, because what Armageddon translated into means mountain of Megiddo, Megiddo, which I have a really hard time. Here it is, if you want to try to pronounce that. And this is the word as it is in Greek. So it is a city in the valley of Jezreel. Megiddo was located at a crucial fork of these ancient highways running along the Mediterranean coast. The road led to Tyre, to Sidon, and while the road to the east led to Damascus. And so if you were really well versed in the New Testament, and specifically with Jesus, talking about Tyre, talking about Sidon, talking about Damascus and what happened to Paul and his road to Damascus, if if you know things about economics and about how roads are the veins of economics, that we've had a terrible ecological disaster that is leading to an economic disaster that then leads to war. And so any student of history knows about this repeating pattern. And there is one place where it appears to be formed, and that is the valley. This valley was the site of many ancient battles. Um, During the conquest, the king was killed by Joshua, and that is the Joshua, the one who followed Moses. And the city was allotted to the half tribe of Manasseh. And so, but Manasseh was able to drive out its Canaanite inhabitants and was later defeated in the vicinity. And by the time of King Solomon, who was the king who followed King David, it was under Israelite control. Solomon made it one of his fortified cities. And I have an image of that. So if you want to see his image of his fortified cities, where did we go? I think it's here. Here we are. So 840 years before the birth of Christ. So this is it. And if you notice the elevation, it is like a valley. And there's the palace, the storehouses, and this has been destroyed and rebuilt, restored and rebuilt, restored. I mean, there are so many layers of archaeology in that. It's pretty astounding. And if you want to know where it is located, this is a Google map. Let me scoot this part out of the way. So you will notice that this is, here's Israel, Lebanon, Syria on this side, and this big red marker is what we're looking at. So we're going to zoom in a bit. And so here's the valley. And I mean, this is as it is today. But you'll notice that there's these ancient markings of roads, and that is the economic status of this area, that things had to travel back and forth. Here's the Sea of Galilee, that's where all the fish were. You got Capernaum, that's where Peter lived, and that's where Jesus started his whole thing. So then, and then you have Tyre here. So, so that's it. It's rather central. And if you head further south, just get an idea, there's Tel Aviv, and we have Jerusalem. So, and then the Dead Sea. Oh, and this is where John was doing his baptizing. So it's all in this fascinating region, and this is the valley. So, and I already showed you that part. I want to make sure I got everything covered. Yep. Okay, so I'm going to stop that and then go back into this. So that's all gathered in the place in Hebrew called Armageddon. In the 1st century, this was a place that was hardly ever mentioned, and not mentioned in the way that if you've read Harry Potter, how they would never say Voldemort's name, they would never say this name because of the destruction that happened there in 2 Kings. Oh, I probably should show that to you. 2 Kings. So there's that. Where do I share? Okay, 2 Kings. This is why they don't talk about the area. The Assyrian king at the Euphrates River, it was there. And King Josiah marched out to intercept him, but it didn't happen, and he killed the king. Josiah's servants took his body from, there it is, Megiddo, in a chariot, Megiddo. They brought him to Jerusalem and buried him in his own tomb, and that's what happened. So this is why they don't mention it. It was a terrible loss, and the king was then brought back and buried, and they lost that part of the land. And so they don't like to talk about it because it was such a bad defeat. So that is now John mentioning it, but mentioning it in rather cloaked language, because again, you don't say Voldemort's name. So so that's that part. And we're going to continue a little bit more and then wrap it up because we have the 7th angel. So the 7th angel poured his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out from the temple saying, "It is done." If you remember Jesus's words that he said on the cross, uh, that's it. So died for the sins of humanity, and now the sins of humanity have all been wrapped up and taken care of. So there were lightning strikes, voices, and thunder, and a great earthquake. Earthquake was greater than any that have occurred since there have been people on the earth. The great city split into three parts, and the cities of the nations fell. God remembered Babylon the Great, so that he gave her the wine cup of his furious anger. Every island fled, and the mountains disappeared. Huge hailstorms, you remember the hail from the plagues? Huge hailstorms weighing about 100 pounds came down from heaven on the people, and they cursed God for the plague of hail because the plague was so terrible. Ecology. So how do you make islands flee and mountains disappear? You flood them. So the water has risen, and there's a great earthquake that did all of this, and Babylon has been split. So that is where we are going to end today's lesson. So I'm going to stop that. And hello, everybody. Now I can see all of you again. And I want to make sure I got the rest of my notes. I did. So I'm now going to take a bit of a breather because I've been talking a lot and I was trying to get through all that material. So I'm now wondering if any of you have any questions. And Daphne, you have marked yes. And I'm wondering if that means that you have a question, or did you errantly mark it?
No, I don't. I've lost you completely, so I don't know what I've done to my phone.
Oh, okay.
No, I don't have a question. I'm just, it's a lot to take in. It's amazing.
It's a lot to take in. Yeah,
But
me too.
Just a trivia thing. The other night on Jeopardy, the contestant was wrong in the answer because he said revelations rather than revelation. And Alex corrected him and said, no, said that's why you didn't get it right. Anyway, just a little.
I have very few.
Thing that gets me about this is it seems like this book should have been at the end of the Old Testament, not at the end of the New Testament, because there's so many references back, as well as, most of the New Testament seems like it's about Christ and the new order and redemption and all of that, and this is kind of in Old Testament language about hail and brimstone.
Hail and brimstone. Yep. Another good reference. Thank you. I had forgotten that one. So yes. Okay. So let's say many will disagree with when it was written, but let's say it was written in 68, 70, somewhere in that range. So the temple still exists. It hasn't been destroyed. Nero has just committed suicide and people are waiting for him to come back to life in 68. Let's say it's then. That is the end of the Old Testament. The New Testament hadn't yet been written. So, it had been written but not collected and put together the way that we have it now. And so John may have seen this as the coming together of the Old Testament, of drawing it all in together. And nowhere in there is Paul quoted. There isn't anything about Timothy. It's really nothing about Peter. That this is all just about Jesus and the Old Testament. So it would be interesting in coming up with a book order of how fascinating it would read to end the Old Testament prophets, and before you hear of the birth narrative, you read about this. If you could read the entire gospel through the lens of Revelation, you would go, oh, that makes sense. And when Jesus is angry, he's actually talking about God's reaction to sin itself. Because when he gets angry, it's about sin. So anyway, thank you, Sandy. That is a wonderful way of looking at it. So I'm going to be thinking more about that as well. So yes, this is, as Daphne said, it is overwhelming. And I have been preparing for the class, and I have done other Revelation classes before, but every time I finish this, I just feel tired, like that was a lot, which is why I was trying to get, chapter 14 done last week so that we could spend more time on it. But Okay, so what other questions do you have, or thoughts or observations? Yes, Ed?
I think your bandwidth is faulty. I don't know. Maybe it's coming in on our end, but I missed your transition from Armageddon to Megadotto. I can't pronounce it either.
You think I'm right. It's not our tongue, right? It's somebody else's tongue who can do that. But the transition, I may have just done a poor job of explaining it. So let me try. Let me try
hear
one.
it.
Okay. Okay. So. Okay, I don't know if I can do it from here. I mean, I can. It'll take me a little bit. Oh, did I show you this picture? There we are.
No.
So this is the valley, and so when you hear the Valley of Armageddon, that's the valley itself. So anyway, looks very nice. And for those that are traveling to Israel, if you ever make it up there, you'll see it. Okay. How do I do this? Okay. The word Nike, Nike, all right? That is a transliteration of a Greek goddess. So the Greek letters look different than Nike, but we are pronouncing it in English with a bad English accent to what Nike, or the Greek goddess, is. And that's the goddess of victory. And so the Nike Shoe Company chose that name specifically because the goddess Nike in Greek mythology means victory. And so, so whenever a Greek speaker sees Nike shoes, they automatically think victory. In America, we just think it's kind of a cool name. Or we think of the phrase, just do it, right? So that's one way we can look at Armageddon, that it is an ancient Hebrew word transliterated into Greek with a sense of, and that's why I threw Voldemort in there, of how do we say this name without saying this name? Same to how Nero isn't named necessarily, but they named him in Roman numbers. But they're not going to say Nero himself. They're going to say the one who looks like this, the one who did that. And so Armageddon is the same thing. And was there a time in U.S. history when we didn't mention Vietnam? I'm trying to, is there, I'm trying to. It's hard in our own culture to have something that we don't talk about that. Battle of Alamo. Anyway, it's hard for me to come up with a comparison. So that is what they're trying. That's what I think John was trying to put out there. That the physical location of this is what I was just showing you. Most likely, that's what it's showing you. Why didn't he call it the Valley of? Why didn't he call it that particular thing? It's because he was trying to put, I think, the spiritual significance. Remember, everything has a physical and a spiritual side, as opposed to equal and opposite. So the spiritual side of what is happening is maybe the battle that happened with the king that had died. Maybe this is now reversing all of that. So the Assyrians invaded the northern territory and destroyed them, and then the Babylons invaded the southern territory and brought them into captivity as well. So, so this is that sense of I don't know. The other image, the other way to try to describe this is, I frequently call myself somebody who is hard to offend, but once I was offended because I saw a man of Japanese and Polynesian descent was wearing a shirt that said, the Pearl Harbor Sailing Club, and it had the date in 1941, and it showed all of Arizona and the rest of the ships that had been destroyed. And it was showing the Nike, or the victory, over U.S. forces, U.S. Navy in that area. And I saw him wearing the shirt, and I was greatly offended. I don't consider that to be a sailing club. I don't consider it to be a victory, but I'm also not of Japanese descent back in those days when they felt as if they needed to strike against the U.S. So, so that would be our Armageddon, maybe. Is this making sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. So it's the thing that people don't want to talk about, but it has to be mentioned, and it's a place on a map. It's also a place of spiritual significance, and with that Armageddon, we have the phrase that it is done, and so that the part that was conquered outside of the city walls in Jerusalem, with Jesus saying it's done, that was for redeeming the sins of humanity. This, it is done, the ecological side of me, the Berkeley, California side of me says, this is God reaping vengeance on all of those who have harmed his garden and have harmed his kingdom by damaging the ecology so bad of the earth. This is God's way of saying it is done. That's one particular reading. I'm not saying that's the right way of reading it, but that's one way of looking at it. Probably not the right way, but it's at least there. So so this part of these visions is complete, and some of you might be wondering, why bother having a chapter 17, right? What, isn't it done? Is it finished? What in the world's going to happen now through the end of the book? And that is because God doesn't destroy something and leave it. That God is going to do something and then redeem it. And so you will then see the redeeming side of God, but first you have to have the anger, the punishment, the wrath, whatever you want to call it, that has to be done. And so the first place that God is starting that redemption is in the valley that no one will mention. So otherwise known as Armageddon. Did that, so Ed, I'm going to unmute you here. Did that make sense?
Sort of. I mean, I don't see the direct correlation why those two words were put together, but I understood that this was an unmentionable and unspeakable place. I get that.
Yeah, right.
I have a quick question for the rest of the group, and they can just answer by nodding their heads, because I'm curious whether my machine, my system, is the one that's having the problem. Were others of you, particularly Larry, I think you had some problems earlier. Was Dave dropping out for y'all too?
Yes.
Okay. Dave, you need to look at your bandwidth somehow. I mean, I don't know. Maybe somebody's on the phone. Maybe somebody's watching a video. Something's happened.
Yeah.
It's happened in other lessons as well.
It has. So I have parked myself as close as I can get to our router.
There you go.
And,
Yeah, just happened.
yeah. So the other thing is I'm using this for a variety of reasons. And number one is that that whatever you say to me, you have to know it's not being broadcast where anybody else can hear it. So this is between us. The second thing is that the microphone on this takes out any of the sound that's happening around me. I even had a helicopter fly over once when I was outside and nobody heard it. So that's kind of fun. Although during Revelation, I guess you probably should have heard it. So last week, because of a malfunction, I switched it, and I'm going to switch. And this is the microphone that's on my computer. And what Rick and I were pondering is that the processor to process both of these things with my computer might make it so that this speaker or this microphone works better. So for next week, if you guys don't mind, I'm going to try using this. First of all, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to try using this microphone. Just know that you're going to pick up the sounds from the house. So, so you'll get everything else happening, but if that's all right, we'll try that and see if that helps. So if I were to not use this, the sound from my computer will come out and interact with the sound from my microphone and cause a different type of sound problem. So, so we will try this.
Are you still using your computer mic?
This is my computer mic, yeah.
Oh, you just went out again.
Really?
Yeah. During that statement, you went out.
Well.
Okay. Well,
I don't know. It could just be
It's not completely going out, but it's kind of like it's echoing, and we're getting
it's
word and
bandwidth is dropping, and it's
Wow.
But it hasn't. Normally, it doesn't last real long.
Yeah. Well, last week I was blaming this on my kids that were doing distance learning, and so 3 of us were online at the same time. They're not doing that this week, so the TV's not on. Yeah, so I don't.
Are you hardwired?
I'm not hardwired yet. That might be the next step.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So
we'll all just drop by and do some gardening on the way.
well, that would be nice. Good. Was that a sickle reference? You're going to bring your sickles and
No, mowers, tools.
Yeah.
Nice.
No sickles.
Good.
I saw a sign, or something on the internet of a sign the other day that said ring doorbell while you weed while you wait.
That's a great idea. All right, so we covered, as you know, we spent very little time on chapter 15. So yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else with that. No? Okay, so any other questions that you all have? Barbara, you've been pretty quiet, but you're muted, so of course that might be why. All right, you're gonna have to unmute your phone.
I also think that it should be at the end of the Old Testament, only because even though it mentions it, we talk about Jesus too. But I have difficulty because I always think that God will forgive us anything if we ask him, that he loves us so much. And all through the book of Revelations, I see him as a very angry God, and he really does punish. But maybe it's like a father or mother punishing when their children do wrong, but they still love him. I just need to reread this and think about it, but it initially disturbed me that God is so punishing in this.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's why I was going to give you an ecological reading, economic and ecological reading at the end to say, what if we did this ourselves? And so what if what John is saying, it looks like it's coming from God, but it's actually, we have made our own bed, what if it's that? So, and then the stubbornness is the other side of these things are happening, but people are being stubborn and they're not repenting. So there's that side of it too. But hopefully I'll be able to redeem some of that and to bring it together. But this isn't necessarily a feel-good book for those who are not under any sort of repression. So it's
Yes.
Yeah, it's for people who are. Yeah, there's a song I was going to play for you, but it's way too long. And it's an old African spiritual that was sung out in the South and on the plantations. And it has been recently redone as a rock song, which you might say that seems impossible. But it has so much imagery to the book of Revelation. So it's one of those spirituals that was sung several hundred years ago. And if you want to know what they believed, that what the slaves, when they were out doing forced labor, of what their belief was, what their theology was, they were quoting and singing many parts of the book of Revelation. And in this particular one, it was saying, when the trumpet sounds, I'm going to rise up out of the ground. And just as Jesus did, so will I. This constant phrase of, even though I am suffering now, when that trumpet blows, if my Christ came out of the tomb, I will come out of my tomb. This whole very sense of pairing oneself with the suffering of Christ, and that he was redeemed, will be redeemed. And so a snapshot of several hundred years ago of theology for that particular group, that the trumpet that sounded was woe to everybody else on earth, but to those who are enslaved, it's a call of freedom. So yeah, it's that idea.
How about playing it for us before the start of the next lesson?
I could, yes.
So that those of us that can come on early that want to hear it.
Yes, there's also the chance I may still be preparing for the class. So,
Could you, well, what's the title of the song? We could.
Yeah, that's
All
a
right.
good idea.
So I'm going to stop recording because I know it'll get flagged by YouTube if I